Every few years, South African citizens get a single, tangible moment of actual power. For the fraction of a second it takes a piece of paper to drop into a box, the playing field levels. When Rise Mzansi launched in April 2023, they pitched themselves directly at voters looking for a fresh start. They positioned the party as a clean, social democratic alternative to the corruption scandals weighing down legacy organizations. But launching a national political apparatus from scratch requires capital. Billboards, rallies, and national outreach campaigns require tens of millions of rands to execute. And as a brand new party, Rise Mzansi did not qualify for any state-allocated taxpayer funds. When a political movement materializes fully formed and highly funded without public money, it raises a question. Who provided the initial investment, and through what channels did it flow? Political opponents, specifically the EFF, targeted the party's origins. They labeled the movement a front for corporate wealth, designed to protect elite interests rather than the needs of ordinary citizens. The rhetoric turned into an official inquiry when the Electoral Commission opened a 2026 probe into the party. The investigation focused on a sudden influx of 30 million rand. What made this 30 million rand injection particularly sensitive was the timing. The money moved during the height of a local election cycle. If millions can be moved during the window when citizens are deciding who to vote for, the electorate loses the ability to see which interests a candidate might prioritize once in office. According to official disclosures, the early capital securing Rise Mzansi's launch came from ultra-wealthy private donors. This included an initial 15 million rand from Rebecca Oppenheimer, heiress to the Anglo-American and De Beers diamond fortune, alongside backing from prominent online gambling entrepreneur Martin Moshall. To get the operation off the ground, backers utilized a specific financial mechanism, the think tank incubator. In this case, an entity called the Rivonia Circle. To be clear, this modern organization shares a name with, but has no connection to the historic Rivonia Six, the anti-apartheid icons. Looking at how this money flows, the Rivonia Circle operated as a staging ground. Operating as a tax-exempt nonprofit allowed wealthy donors to fund foundational campaign work, like public polling and branding, without triggering disclosures. Because this occurred before Rise Mzansi officially registered, it sidestepped laws tracking political money. This incubator bypass means a modernized political campaign can be engineered and paid for in the shadows before the public is introduced to the candidate. The 2026 probe also highlighted a second method for moving money, the loan-to-donation conversion. Looking at this timeline of an election cycle, here is how it works. A donor injects millions of rands directly into an active campaign. By officially classifying the cash as a temporary commercial loan, the influx is legally shielded from immediate disclosure. After the election, the debt is forgiven. It instantly converts to a political donation, effectively bypassing the upper financial limits. This sequence allows private backers to saturate a campaign with cash during the voting period, only for the public to discover the true source and scale of the funding once the results are final. When you trace the money back to its source, the practical implications become clear. It forces the question of how much quiet influence diamond mining fortunes and online gambling moguls might exert over a new party's policies on labor laws, corporate regulation, or resource management. The mechanisms we've explored, the incubators and loan conversions, operate within the boundaries of the law. They are not fraud, but systemic, legalized loopholes. They facilitate a top-down transfer of power. They allow elite financial players to engineer the political landscape, while bypassing the transparency laws meant to protect the public. As citizens head to the polls, the clean branding of a campaign is only the surface. Protecting the vote requires looking deeper and asking who is footing the bill.
A clean political alternative. Look, when Rise Mzansi launched into the public consciousness back in April 2023, they presented us with a really fascinating paradox. On one hand, they stated this strong ideological goal of being a social democratic alternative, focused on clean governance, prioritizing working-class citizens. But on the other hand, their operational reality tells a completely different story. We're talking tens of millions in private capital. So how exactly does the party champion ideals that favor everyday labor while relying almost entirely on the extreme private wealth of a few highly influential individuals?
The cost of getting started.
To understand why this happens, we really have to look at the strict, cold, legal constraints of campaign finance here in South Africa. State-allocated taxpayer funds? Well, they are entirely withheld from newly formed political parties. Because these new parties haven't contested an election yet and have 0 seats in parliament, they get absolutely nothing from the state. 0. This barrier to entry is ruthlessly high. It basically forces new ventures to seek out elite private backers just to survive their own birth. The R15 million question. When the official disclosures were finally released through My Vote Counts, the sheer scale of the financial injections became public record. 15 million rands. This single, massive initial deposit came from Rebecca Oppenheimer just to get the party off the ground. She is, of course, the heiress to the Anglo-American and De Beers diamond fortunes. So we aren't talking about grassroots crowdfunding here. We are talking about historic, intergenerational wealth being injected straight into a brand new entity. So who exactly is bankrolling this movement? Well, alongside Rebecca Oppenheimer, whose contributions, by the way, actually increased over time, we have Martin Moschall. Now, Moschall is a prominent tech investor with deep, deep roots in the online gambling industry, providing major financial backing through entities like Main Street 1564. The real analytical question we need to ask isn't just about the raw numbers on a spreadsheet. It's about proximity. How does the heavy involvement of ultra-wealthy individuals and corporate titans actually impact a social democratic agenda? In-kind campaign contributions. Now, it's crucial to remember that elite influence isn't exclusively injected through raw cash deposits. We also have to examine in-kind campaign contributions. Entities like Injoli Design and Kairos Communications provided absolutely essential early structural, marketing, and communication support, and this was valued at hundreds of thousands of rands. A new party desperately needs a slick brand and a solid digital infrastructure just to be taken seriously. But by providing these sophisticated services in kind, private corporate entities become deeply embedded in the very messaging apparatus of the party right from day one.
The oligarch wealth accusation.
As you'd expect, when this funding pattern became undeniable public record, the ideological collision was immediate. Political opponents, most notably the economic freedom fighters, levied a very specific, targeted attack. They claimed Rise Mzansi was, quote, bought by oligarch wealth. The accusation here is that the party exists not as a genuine grassroots movement, but as a highly sophisticated vehicle to protect elite corporate interests, all wrapped up under the guise of reform. It's the promise of clean politics colliding violently with accusations of corporate capture. Which leaves us with a massive final thought to dissect. Does transparency excuse elite influence, or is it just the necessary cost of entry in modern politics? Look, Rise Mzansi declared their donors openly. They complied fully with transparency laws. But does the mere act of transparency mitigate the inherent influence of that wealth? As we navigate the structural realities of our political landscape, you really have to weigh this tension for yourself. Can any new movement authentically maintain its social democratic goals when its very survival depends on the absolute wealthiest individuals in the country?
Opponents, specifically the economic freedom fighters, claim these parties are effectively purchased by oligarch wealth to ensure that the interests of the corporate elite remain protected. However, this domestic debate over legal donors often obscures a different, more complex financial current. While the front door is open to public inspection, a much larger flow of capital enters the country through a nearly invisible side entrance. South African law is clear on one point. It is illegal for foreign governments or state-linked entities to deposit money directly into a local political party's bank account. Yet a backdoor exists through the nonprofit organization, or NPO. Unlike political parties, NPOs operate under a different set of financial disclosure rules, allowing them to receive international funds with far less oversight. This loophole allows foreign influence to enter the domestic political arena under the label of civic development. It turns NGOs into financial conduits, moving resources from foreign capitals into South African civil society. Several international institutions actively utilize this pathway. One of the most prominent is the National Endowment for Democracy, which receives its primary funding directly from the U.S. Congress. This network is bolstered by Western billionaire-backed groups, such as the Open Society Foundations, which provide significant funding to local activist and policy organizations. In Europe, German taxpayer-funded groups like the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung operate similarly, maintaining a deep presence in South African policy circles. This money is rarely handed over as direct cash for billboards or rallies. Instead, it arrives as in-kind support, think tank research, logistical expertise, and organizational training for emerging political leaders. Musi Maimene's Bosa has become a primary beneficiary of this indirect architecture, utilizing the research and policy frameworks built by these foreign-backed entities. Academics refer to this process as NGOization. This model provides a specific structure for local movements. It takes the energy of grassroots frustration and channels it into policy workshops and legal briefs. By prioritizing administrative reforms and good governance, it naturally de-emphasizes the more radical structural changes that often drive local protests. This backdoor allows foreign donors to help shape the character of new political movements, ensuring their goals remain within a moderate, Western-approved framework before they ever reach the ballot. When a country's civil society relies on foreign capital for its survival, the tension eventually moves from policy papers to the actual landscape of the nation. This leads to sovereign capture, a condition where a nation's policy direction is heavily influenced by external financial forces that sit entirely outside the democratic voting process. The most effective tool in this process is strategic litigation. By funding specialized legal networks, these groups can challenge government decisions in court, effectively slowing the machinery of the state. We see this in the energy sector. Major national infrastructure projects designed to solve the power crisis are frequently stalled by foreign-backed NGO litigation. These legal battles create developmental delay. Infrastructure rollout and economic growth are placed on indefinite hold. The front door of local wealth and the back door of foreign capital both work to set the parameters of political life. Together, they define what is considered a realistic policy, creating an invisible set of guardrails for any new party. This financial architecture ensures that the South African economy remains aligned with the expectations of international markets. By channeling political energy into courtrooms and policy debates, the system makes it increasingly difficult for any movement to implement a radical redistribution of the nation's wealth. Immense private capital easily outspends the grassroots. Elite financial networks can saturate the political landscape and shape public discourse long before a single citizen even registers to vote. The scale of this capital requires context. The Oppenheimer fortune originates directly from the historical extraction of South African resources. This photo captures the early days of diamond mining, showing the harsh manual labor and the sheer physical scale of wealth accumulation that built empires like Anglo-American and De Beers. Political opponents, notably the economic freedom fighters, regularly point out that this inherited capital is now being deployed to fund new political vehicles. They argue the objective is to protect elite corporate interests rather than serve ordinary citizens. But direct campaign funding is only the most visible way that wealth enters the political system. It represents the front door, an attempt to influence the direction of the country through the ballot box. Private wealth cannot guarantee victory at the polls. To exert control over national policy regardless of who wins an election, this capital requires a secondary, less transparent route. That backdoor relies on a broader structural network, shifting the focus away from domestic billionaires to heavily resourced, foreign-funded legal organizations. This brings us to a tactic known as strategic litigation. We can trace the flow of foreign capital and domestic wealth directly into a centralized network of non-governmental organizations. These civil society groups use this massive funding to combat state policies. By routing resources through these hubs, they bypass the executive branch and the voting public entirely, taking the dispute straight to the courts. Under this system, elected mandates lose their authority. National policy is effectively decided by whoever has the capital required to keep a case tied up in litigation for years. The Helen Suzman Foundation serves as a prime example of this legal machinery operating in tandem with elite interests. We can see this strategy deployed in cases like the Helen Suzman Foundation versus the Minister of Home Affairs. This image of the Constitutional Court bench highlights the immense procedural weight of the judiciary, a formidable, highly complex barrier that the state must constantly navigate. It creates a severe financial asymmetry. Well-funded foundations can sustain these lawsuits endlessly, while the state government is forced to bleed its limited public resources just to defend its own policies. The judicial system was designed as a democratic safeguard. In practice, it has become a bottleneck where the wealthy can unilaterally veto state decisions through sheer financial endurance. These two strategies, wealth-bought political parties on one side and well-funded lawfare on the other, merge to create what is effectively an invisible veto over the state. This deliberate pincer movement traps the national government. Critical legislation, like land reform and socioeconomic restructuring, is forced into years of procedural purgatory, slowly grinding institutional momentum to a dead halt. The result of this shadow network isn't always a change in law. The constant friction simply exhausts the state's capacity to act, delaying transformation for years. These calculated delays carry a severe real-world impact. As policy stalls in the courts, vital infrastructure projects languish, and formal housing for South Africa's vulnerable Black majority is perpetually deferred. While domestic development remains stalled, national policy stays optimized for global investor markets rather than the immediate survival of the local population. The core promise of equal representation, the idea that every citizen's vote carries equal weight, is rendered hollow when private wealth can simply purchase an override switch. Until this dual-pronged capture is dismantled, the very institutions meant to protect the people will continue to be weaponized to silence them.